Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us. We greatly appreciate you being here to both engage in this conversation with us and with these panelists that have graciously offered their time and energy to be with us and offer their thoughts. My name is Peter Jones. I'm one of the full-time faculty members at the Institute of Pastoral Studies and also serve as the Associate Dean. This particular event emerged from the Student Engagement Committee. So it emerged from a conversation about student concerns. And in partnership with the Alumni Relations Office here at Loyola, we've been able to organize this event for us all today. Welcome to the online community. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to be monitoring on my computer the live stream, so if any of you watching online would like to offer questions or comments, please by all means do that, and we will work to bring that into this space. Really quickly to get a, will you go mute? Really quickly to get my, I can hear the echo from my computer in the live stream. I forgot to hit the mute button, minor detail. One of the reasons that we organized this event in this sort of way was to have people react to a document that they may not be familiar with and simply to offer whatever emerges to them. So whatever it is that they see or don't see, whatever they think is missing, whatever they think is glorious about the document that they encounter from their different locations. So we sought people from all of these different locations. A person from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who I hope will graciously emerge, too sweet, from the elevator bay, Donna Grimes. Kandice is an alum of Loyola University Chicago from the law school and working at the Workers Center for Racial Justice as a movement politics director. Nephtalie is a student and a student worker at the Institute of Pastoral Studies, dual degree student in social justice and social work. And Cynthia is, Dr. Stewart is a member of the Loyola community presently working in the Office for Experiential Learning. So we have people that are coming from various different contexts with various concerns, interests, and questions. And so we asked them to put this document in front of them and simply offer their reflections. So without any further ado, what we're going to do is just go one after the other, right down the row. I've asked them to aim for somewhere in the range of 10 minutes apiece. And then after everyone has had a chance to offer their thoughts, we're going to open it up to a Q&A to everyone here and online. And then finally, when that Q&A period is settling down and over, we've got some snacks after and some drinks on this side. So we invite you to stay and visit some more. Great. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to start with Ms. Harris on the side and then work this way. Thank you.
I was wondering which side.
Oh, will you turn your mic on? They're wireless and
All right.
Have batteries. So.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So thanks for inviting me. It's so great to be here today. I'm excited to speak at my alma mater. And it's really special because I chose to attend Loyola for law school because of the dedication that they have to social justice and the study of law and in the legal profession. So we were asked to basically, from our location experience, read this letter and speak about what comes to mind. So I'm going to focus my comments in response to the letter around the work that I do with social justice, Black liberation, and how the letter instructs on the role of practicing love in the quest of justice. So I became a community organizer about 2 years ago, and one of my first formal community organizing trainings, I was presented with this quote that discusses understanding power and justice. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So that's a quote from Martin Luther King that I'd actually never heard, but when I was at this training, we were learning about organizing power and how power is a lot of times seen as a bad thing, but you have to have power with love to be able to create and find justice in your community. So how could power be good, and how can it be used to liberate ourselves and seek justice for all? So I work for the Workers Center for Racial Justice, And when we're telling people about who we are, I say we're a Black liberation organization seeking to build independent political power within our communities. But like, what does that mean? So I guess I'll discuss like how the letter spoke to me as far as speaking to the concept of liberation and how it directly correlates with the idea of racial justice. So the letter spoke about the concept of liberty, equality, and justice. And when I was thinking of that, I was like, you usually hear those together. I kind of thought of like the Pledge of Allegiance, because you can't have one without the other. In order to seek and establish justice, one must be equal and liberated in the eyes of society. So the letter also mentioned that justice requires an honest acknowledgement of our failures in restoring relationships and speaking to racial reconciliation, and that it requires a determined effort and humility. So as in my work of seeking justice and liberation for Black communities and people everywhere, we're inherently seeking liberation through liberty, equality, and justice because you can't do one without the other. And so racial justice can only be accomplished through leveraging power and love, as Dr. King spoke about in that quote. So how do we seek liberation through power and love, as the letter instructs us to do? Because the letter spent a good bit of time talking about love, and how Jesus instructs us that that's one of the greatest commandments, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so that kind of stood out to me, and I remember back in this quote when I first began organizing. So first we're going to talk about power, because power is like one of the biggest things that we talk about when we talk about community organizing and what it means to empower people and empower your community. So it's one of the first things that we learn about, because we have to understand how to build that, and like I said, how to instruct what power is, and also how to discuss the context of power. And power can be a good and a bad thing. We know we've seen like sinful power. I think it spoke a little bit about that, about sin as an inhibitor of justice. And I actually wrote down the phrase that they spoke about as a lust to dominate another. And I was like, yeah, that's that bad political power that we often see oppressing our communities. So when I work with folks, when I teach the members that I organize around power, I always discuss it in this context of like good power, which is selfless, but if it's too selfless, then it loses its punch. So in the political context, it's because I do a lot of political work, like I see that bad power a lot. I organize in the 5th Ward, the 6th Ward, 7th Ward, 20th Ward, 27th Ward. So that's like South Side and a little bit of West Side. And a lot of times when I'm spending my time talking to people in the community, we talk about the need for us to come together to build power, to seek justice. And a lot of times the concerns are that, well, the people that I've elected to represent me, the people that are in power, like look around, look at my community, like what is that doing for me? I'm honestly against the thought of power, because the context of it has been there's nothing loving about this. And the danger in that is that the opposite of power is powerlessness, which is, when I was reading the letter, I thought of that as almost that sinfulness of power, because powerlessness is really dangerous. Because when people, and it spoke about this in the part of the letter that spoke about the African American experience, it can be self-destructive. When you feel like you don't have power to change things, that's how you see, the fact that there's historically low voter turnout in a lot of Black communities, because people don't see their vote as power. They don't see anything that they do in interacting with these systems that are supposed to be creating justice, and it becomes self-destructive, because if you're not exercising certain, civic engagement, then it's gonna impose on itself. Like you're not gonna gain power, and then the people in power aren't gonna listen to you. So when I was reading the letter, I was thinking about that juxtaposition of powerlessness that can be felt within the community, and how that also feeds into a lack of faith that justice can even be achieved. So in order to truly find liberation, we have to build power through love. And love is what will balance that sinful nature of power and have the ability to change systems that oppress us based on race. The part of the quote that says love is anemic without power, I think that's really powerful because it's just not enough to like have unconditional love. Being nice and going about ways, sometimes how the civil rights movement is described as like nonviolence and not apathy, but nonviolence and a very like let's get along nature. No, because nobody's going to do anything until you create that sense that if something's not done, and the community is going to speak up, and you should feel responsive to that. So there was a part in the letter that talked about the first Black priest in the U.S. and how he was able to forgive of all the wrongdoings that were done to him, being the first, being treated poorly by the folks within his own community. But it made me think that it's just not enough to forgive. Because if we're going to truly seek racial justice, we have to do more than that. We have to learn how to, as a community, stand up for ourselves and fight back against the continued oppression. And so that's what I do for a living. I'm a movement politics director. I talk to people about what that looks like in practice. However, in these conversations, love is always present because what's essential to an organizer is that you organize around relationships, and the strength of your relationships will determine the success of whatever you're trying to organize. So we organize people around those relationships and those bonds that tie us together. Love of self, first and foremost, love of family, love of God, love of community. And those are the things that drive our members and people that we work with to come out, to work hard against the challenges of these systemic oppressions that we face in the city of Chicago. Because it's a long, hard road when you're talking about Black liberation and racial justice. I mean, we're talking about centuries and still systems that continually oppress and actually are driving Black families out of the city. So only through those relationships that we build with our members and that bring them together through the love of just wanting to improve their community, that's how we build our power. And outside of the Black community, we build power with our allies and other communities around a sense of racial equity and justice. That although our organization's priorities and commitments to our communities may differ, I operate when I build these relationships with an assumption that we all have the best intentions to seek racial justice and equity. And through operating through that, which is hard sometimes because, there's a lot of different factors going on when you're talking about movement building. But I always operate when I'm building relationships with new organizations or with new communities through an assumption that we're all trying to do something good. Because that's the only way that we can really do the continuous work. And that's an act of faithfulness and love in itself that I think the letter speaks to. And it also builds that bridge to continued racial reconciliation. And some examples of that I come into contact with during the work with my organizations, there's this really great organization that is a sister organization of ours called Southsiders Organizing for Unity and Liberation, and they actually organize parishes in the South and South suburbs around some of the issues around issues of Black liberation. And then also you see examples of Father Flager and his work in St. Sabina as far as pushing the needle on racial justice and equity. So I just have a few closing thoughts on some of the things that I continue to work on and the role of power and love that was discussed in the letter and how they interact with the quest for racial justice. So unconscious bias is more prevalent than racism. Like, the letter spoke that a lot of people don't want to think about themselves as racist, and I very seldomly encounter like truly racist people, but we all have unconscious bias. And it's still immensely harmful to the liberation of all communities, and it's something that we have to continue to work to address. So we have to continue to create allyships and creating power in communities without privilege, but we also have to incite love and understanding in communities of privilege to create some ownership over those concerns of unconscious bias to be able to work together to attain racial equity. This is something that's really near to and dear to our organization, is the continuing fighting against mass incarceration and racist policing policies. Our organization was actually started by formerly incarcerated Black folks from the South Side who were having trouble finding work, because we know that when you've been part of the criminal justice system, even though you've served time, or even if you didn't serve time, whenever you have some kind of conviction record or even arrest record, it changes the trajectory of your life. And we see that it's not properly applied from community to community. So what I'll continue to do in my work is continue fighting against what I believe to be an inherently inhumane and a system that disproportionately affects Black communities, and continue to build power around that. But also, and we do that in organizing formerly incarcerated people. But I also find that there's an immense amount of love in that work, because to organize people and to bring people together and share their stories of how the system has affected them, to be able to relate with communities that might not understand and bring them into our movement so we can continue to build power and change those systems. Like, I see so much love and trust in my members and the way that they open themselves up to honestly would have been like negative situations, but they're turning into something good. So I thought of that when I was reading the letter as well. And then to continue to promote economic access. So the letter spoke about in the African American experience, that's something that is systemic oppression and systemic racism. So we have to continue to press to work towards that through job creation and resource allocation. Like I said, we're the Worker Center for Racial Justice, so inherently we want to just create economic access so that Black people and all people in the community can live equally and have equal access to opportunity. And we only do that by demanding access, by building numbers and organizing around strong campaigns. And we do that, and it's powerful through the love that we have for our community and for our children and for our future. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Nephtalie Lesperance, and I am a student with IPS in the social work department. So from my interpretation of this text, I'm going to be looking more from the educational background and a little bit of history. So for me, I did appreciate that the document took some time to explain racism a little bit more. I think, especially for my background, I'm from Florida, and so a lot of the times the topic of racism is always attributed to the South. And so I appreciated that part of the document also acknowledged that there is this reality that silence has played a role in continuing the structure of racism all over this country. And so, but one of the things that for me that stood out is the conversation around the reappearance of symbols of hatred. And so for me, just a little bit about my background, my family is from Haiti, and so a huge part of me getting involved with racial justice work is taking the time to really understand Black history and all the realities that come with being an African American in this country, in this context. And so for me, in reading this document, seeing this conversation around the reappearance felt really odd to me. especially knowing that there are still a lot of structures that are up. If you look at like monuments, flags, parks and public buildings, all of these things are kind of named after figures in this from this country and from the Confederacy that have done horrible things, but we have not acknowledged that. And so one of the things that I really was struggling with a little bit with this document is like it kind of seemed to highlight this whole "this is not our country" narrative that I hear often, where it's like, oh, this is not who we were. We're not this. We're not racist. We haven't struggled with this. And so I know later they talked about how to do justice, we needed to have an honest acknowledgement of what we've done and what we're responsible for. But even in parts of this document, I felt like there was a little bit of ignoring our history in that. And so even with a social work lens, one of the things that we're constantly learning and talking about is the idea of like understanding the history of policy and structures, and how everything works together, and how we need to understand how one policy affects the other one and affects the next one. And I did not see much of a conversation about that. I mean, it brushed on it a little bit, but I would have really appreciated if more of the document focused on what policies we have put in place and how we could even, talk amongst our community as a church to even talk about it more and address it. And so I felt like that was a big component that was missing from the conversation, is like an honest look of how these institutions have been set in place and how these policies affect everything else. And so, but aside from that, one thing I really appreciated was the reality that they are asking us to listen to other people, listen to other people's stories. And in social work, one of the biggest things that we talk about constantly is the idea of cultural humility, and how it is so important for us to really make it a habit to constantly surround ourselves with other people that we are not familiar with, so that we can learn from them, learn from their experiences, and really take the step to understand who they are. And in doing that, it doesn't say that because I spent time talking to someone different from me that I completely understand everything, but at least it gives me a greater picture of what's going on. And so for me, it had me thinking about the reality that a lot of our communities tend to be homogeneous, where you have people that only look like you in your community. And so when we have this conversation of racism, I think sometimes it is hard for people to recognize like that they're in a narrow view of the world, because they're only surrounded by their own perspective, their own types of people. And so one thing I would have wanted to see more is maybe some active steps of how to, I don't want to say force, but kind of encourage more of like, let's step out of our space and really go and learn about the other people, and not from a context of, I know they mentioned paternalism, where you're kind of going to another country to kind of, hey, I'm going to help people, or I'm going to, tell them what to do, but actually going and learning and understanding from, understanding from the heart of I really care. And so for me, I know with my own background, that's something that I find very troubling. And I know me and my family, since there's a lot of people that end up going to Haiti to visit, it's a conversation that we have sometimes, because like one of my cousins has mentioned how it's weird for him and for another friend of his that they visit states in this country where they're not taking care of people of color, but then they'll have the same people come over and try to help like people in Haiti. And so that's such an awkward, an awkward position. And so I think that's something within the church too that we should be more open to challenge, because it's hard to, I know for me especially, sometimes it's hard to be in spaces where we're applauding like overseas missions and things like that, but then we look within our own neighborhoods and we're not really doing the same things that we're going overseas to do. And I can imagine, especially if you're raised in this country and you're African American especially, or Mexican or whatever, that you're seeing this as well, and it's something that is very difficult for you to digest. And so I think in saying that, I think for me, one of the things I wish could be added or considered is like more of a conversation about even the church's role in this. I know for me, I'm from a Protestant background, but one of the things that I know that we've struggled with is, you know, having such a active role in continuing institutions of racism. I know, for example, just in my own research, it only took up to like 2016 for the Southern Baptist Convention to finally say, hey, we should take Confederate flags down from our buildings. And so I think it says a lot when, on one hand, we're saying, hey, I want to combat this issue, but then we're also supporting symbols and a bunch of different things that are still reenacting the same evil things that we're trying to fight. And so I think I really enjoyed the conversation around education and really educating our church about the realities of what is really America, what has really happened here. And I know for me, another part of my reality is that I went to Christian school for a good chunk of my life, and there's a lot of things that I felt were like almost deliberately taken out of curriculum and not talked about. And even, again, from my own context, when we talked about Haiti, we only focused on like the really bad things about Haiti, like whether it's like voodoo or whatever. But when it was really time to talk about other things, like about the good of a lot of other countries, we always skip that. And I know I was lucky that I could go home and ask my parents, and they would say otherwise, but I imagine other people in these contexts and that experience these same things, they don't have that resource to challenge that. They just kind of take it as at face value. And so that was one of the things that I felt like if there was more a conversation centered around just the importance of like really looking at our history, examining it, just repenting of it, it could help this conversation move along a lot further than where we are now. And so I think my takeaway of this, aside from history, is just the importance of just checking our motivations of like why we get involved in this kind of work as well. Because I think it's so easy to be afraid to have the conversation around racism. But then also, I feel like there's this fear of like having conversations and acting just because there's a fear of like not appearing racist. And so I think what Kandice said is correct, that we all have this implicit bias. And I think when we come from a position of, I know this is here and I can humbly try to work to address this, we don't have to feel as afraid to make a mistake when we may not know something or when we may say something wrong. I mean, even from my context, like I don't know everything. So I may be Black, but there's experiences that I'm not familiar with that I'm learning. And so I think that's something that we all have to be aware of, that we all have blind spots. And then the final thing is that just to also have this understanding that this work is going to be challenging, but it's also going to it might cost you something. And I think I know from my own experiences as a student now, and we have a lot of conversations around just the cost of really doing effective social work. And so sometimes that might mean you might give a little bit more time, you might lose friends, you might lose power, but we have to be willing to make those sacrifices if we really want to see something different happen.
Well, good evening. Is this on?
I think it's on now.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Cynthia Stewart. I work here at Loyola University at the Lakeshore campus. I'm the assistant director for the Center for Experiential Learning. I handle all of the academic internships for the undergraduate students, which is required before they graduate from Loyola. So thank you, Peter, for this invite to be here on this panel with these other wonderful women. As they have already stated, we read the document, Open Wide Our Hearts, The Enduring Call to Love, a Pastoral Letter Against Racism. As a lot of what they've already said, with myself, I grew up a cradle Catholic, so I was the only Catholic in my family. I knew that it shaped me to be who I am today. A lot of the virtues and the values that I learned of being a Catholic has really allowed me to be the woman that I am. So one of the things that just stuck out in the letter was the aspect of listening to the stories of others. That's one of the things that is really important. So if you're going to try to tackle any type of racism, prejudice, there needs to be an opportunity to listen to the other, and that space needs to be created. So I've taught at a couple of universities, but one thing that stands out is I was at North Park University, which is where I got my Master's of Divinity and my Master's in Christian Education. And I was adjuncting there, and I had the opportunity to, it was called Sankofa, where we had the undergraduate students be partnered with another individual. So it was African American that was paired with a Caucasian. And we was put on a bus, and we rode from Chicago to Alabama. And you had to stick with your partner the whole trip. And so whenever we was on the bus, and so we was watching movies that, that just talked about racism, and we had to stop and kind of talk about those situations. And it got really uncomfortable. So I was one of the leaders, but I was still partnered with someone. And it was an opportunity where you could not get off the bus. I mean, you literally was on the road. You could not run from it. Only way you could run from the conversation was to go to the bathroom. That's the only way that you were going to try to run from it. But you had to come back to your seat, right? So there was no running from it. It was intentional that you had to stick with this partner. So everywhere, so when we stopped to go eat, you had to sit next to your partner. When we got to the hotel, you were in the room with your partner. And this was a 3-day trip. And it's something that has stuck in my mind, and I believe that it was something that prepared the students to be very uncomfortable. But once we came back, so we went to the Martin Luther King Museum, we went to the church where the 4 little girls was killed, and we had those hard conversations. And for a lot of the Caucasian students, this was new to them. A lot of people hear about Martin Luther King and they hear, quotes from him, but to actually be in the space and to actually hear the various things that he was doing from a theological standpoint, from a social justice standpoint, the work of justice that he did here in Chicago, and just things that they was not even aware of. So that's one of the things that I pulled from the letter that talked about you have to create this space. And in order to try to combat racism and prejudice, you have to create the space. And North Park created that space for their students so that they could have those uncomfortable conversations. And even on the bus ride back, it was still a continuous conversation. And even once we got back to campus, 3 days later, it was a thing of we're still going to continue this conversation. So in order to try to do this work, it's a continuous work. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, and the letter talked about that. This is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be a kumbaya opportunity where we're all going to be in the room and we're going to talk, and then all of a sudden a change is going to come. It's going to come from having a dialogue, me getting to know you, you getting to know me. And once we take that time to hear someone's story, one thing that you find is there's a common thread. There's a common thread between my story and your story. The struggle that I may have gone through may be a similar story for which you may have gone through. So it's in that midst of having those conversations that change can actually take place. And I think that's one of the intentional things that needs to happen within the church, within schools, within communities, that it's not the I'm coming here to be for you, but I'm coming here to be with you. How can I do ministry with you and not ministry for you? John McKnight from Northwestern put together what's called the asset-based community development. And within that, they talk about that the glass is half full and it's half empty, right? And it's the same thing that we have to see within individuals. So when you go into communities, so I used to teach a course at Trinity Christian College, and what I would do, so I taught a religion, it was called Religion in the City. So what I would do, so I had very conservative Christian students, a lot of them who did not know what it meant to, go on the south side of Chicago, to go to Pilsen, to go to Auburn Gresham, to go to any of those communities. They thought Chicago was just a downtown area. So to say, to say Rogers Park, they felt like they was in the suburbs. So to know you're not in the suburbs, you're still in Chicago. If you go maybe about 10 more blocks, you're in Evanston. Now you're no longer in Chicago. But what I did within my course, and for some of the professors that are in the room, I intentionally take my students out into the community. So I take them so I used to be at Faith Community St. Sabina. Kandice mentioned Father Flager. I was there at that church for over 25 years. Was in executive leadership under Father Flager. And that was another part of me that the social justice just rose out of me for being at that church. Because he was the radical, as the book calls it, he was the radical disciple. He was the one who decided, I'm going to be a change agent. I'm going to take the principles of Martin Luther King and I'm going to bring it to the modern day of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now into 2000s. And that's one of the things that I just remember is just those difficult means of we're going to go out and we're going to protest. And we're going to protest against billboards that are only targeted for the south side of Chicago. Billboards with liquor and cigarettes, that if you were to go in other parts of the city, you don't see those billboards. So for those who are not familiar, Father Flager decided that he would go and we're going to make change about that. So similar to something that Nephtalie said was, what's some action? What's some examples? That's what I was looking for in this document. What's some examples of what you've already done? They did mention, these are starting some listening sessions, but I was curious about what has been done prior to this. What has the Catholic Church been doing in order to try to combat this? Especially, I'm very familiar with a lot of African Americans within the Catholic Church who have been ridiculed for being an African American and being a Catholic. And that is, just a lot of just injustices that were done. It wasn't my generation, but it was generations of older individuals that I know who are Catholic, and just hearing those stories of just the things that the Catholic Church kind of excluded them from various things. So I was curious about, so how are you going to change those things? How are you going to reconcile that and bring individuals back into the circle where they're proud to be a Black Catholic? So those were some of the things that stood out. One of the things that I really liked was they talked about, some suggestions of, as she stated, exposing individuals to actually go to, to Washington, D.C., and go to the various museums. So the individuals who are here in Chicago, you don't have to go to D.C. You can go to the DeSable Museum here in Chicago. There's a American Indian Museum that's in Evanston. There's the Holocaust Museum that's in Skokie. You don't have to go, similar to what you were saying. I don't have to go abroad. I've gone abroad. I've done that. But what's here in Chicago that you could actually tap into, and how can you, reach out? Chicago has a wealth of museums and various things that you could use in order to educate others and educate yourself. The Chicago History Museum. So those are different ways that, you can get groups of individuals and then have a debriefing session afterwards. So those were some of the various things that stuck out to me. From a theological standpoint, because I was a seminary student, I've taught theology courses, but one of the things that stuck out was this statement that says, "It is sinful when individuals or groups exclude, ridicule, mistreat, or unjustly discriminate against persons on the basis of their race or ethnicity. They violate justice. They reveal a failure to acknowledge the human dignity of the persons offended, to recognize them as the neighbors Christ calls us to love." That was one of the statements that just really stood out to me. And it reminded me of Luke 10:25-37, that talks about the Good Samaritan. So for my master's thesis, I went to Garrett Evangelical, which is at the campus of Northwestern. And for my master's thesis, when I was going around and just wondering, what am I going to do, my project on? And one of my mentors said, it's going to be a class that is going to, the light bulb moment is going to come on. And it was one of my ethics courses. And it was around the time that, this was like 1998, when the public housing buildings here in Chicago were scheduled to be torn down. So that was a light bulb moment for me. I never lived in public housing, never walked in public housing. My brother always told me, stay away. He kind of warned me about, don't go over in those particular areas. But it was a light bulb moment when I heard about the public housing buildings being torn down. So from a theological standpoint, the question that started in my mind is, where's the church? So these individuals, so in this document, it talked about the Native Americans and the dislocation and them having to be relocated. And that immediately brought to mind about the individuals in Chicago public housing and them being dislocated from their homes. And so the project that I worked on, I actually did an exegesis of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, talks about the role of the priest was actually the one that went on the other side of the road and really did not help out, right? But I wanted to flip that and say, there are individuals within the church that actually do go on that side of the road and actually do want to help those that they see who are in need. So what I did was I wanted to find out what church is on a mission to help the individuals that are being dislocated, or that have a mission, that have a heart that is looking to help out, the individuals. So Fourth Presbyterian Church, which is right down the street, for over 50 years, Fourth Presbyterian has been instrumental in the Cabrini Green area. Cabrini Green is just a mile away from here. And for those who are not familiar with Chicago, Cabrini Green was one of the worst public housing buildings sections here in Chicago. And so what I researched was, what was the role of the church in helping those individuals that was in public housing? So one of the tutoring center that is within Fourth Presbyterian has been in existence for over 55 years. And it's one of the largest, tutoring programs here in Chicago. So that is how you can hear the stories of others. That is how you can step outside of the church and go into a community and actually work with and not for. And I looked at that within my thesis. I heard the stories of the individuals that was living in the public housing. I listened to the stories of the kids that were talking about, my home is being torn down. I have to relocate. I was listening to those stories, and then I brought those stories back to Fourth Presbyterian, and I shared those stories with them. And Fourth Presbyterian is intentional about going over, into that area and actually working and actually helping in the ways that they can kind of combat the injustice that's taking place. So that's the main things that was sticking out. But one of the things, just to go back to what that stated, was, who is my neighbor? Who is your neighbor? That's the question that you have to ask. Are you willing to have your neighbor be someone that doesn't look like you? Are you willing to have your neighbor be a person that I'm not going to grab my purse when I see them walking next to me? Are you going to see them through the eyes of God and not see them as, someone that might harm me? Are you going to see them as, oh, they're an asset? Are you going to be able to talk to them and speak to them? I have a habit, because my family is from the South, I speak to people. And that's kind of a thing that's not a norm here in Chicago. But if I'm in the elevator, if I'm walking, or when I walk in the office, I speak to people. And I like to get to know people. And it's through the midst of that that you start loosening up a little bit. And it's kind of like that, you're on that bus situation and you can't get off, and you're on that elevator, and you say, you know what, it's good, to be able to get to know someone that I'm not familiar with. To go back to Trinity, I took, and this was part of the article that talked about the ecumenical and the interreligious dialogue. I would take my students to other religious communities that they were not familiar with. So I would take them to Muslim mosques. I would take them to Buddhist temples. And for a lot of them, that was uncomfortable. I make my students uncomfortable. And that's my role. And that's what I do that. I'm the African-American female professor that will make you uncomfortable. And I let them know that the first week of class, at some point, you're going to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to give you an assignment that you may not like, but by the end of the semester, or once you're out of this class, I'm quite sure you'll think back, and it's going to be something that's rewarding. So I would, actually do that for them, is to take them and tell them that you cannot leave your biases and be able to go in with listening ears. How can you go in and listen, to the imam talk about, his religion and what he does? So those are some things that I think is some intentional things that can be done in order to combat some things that they were talking about in the article. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We knew that we would get a diverse set of responses from people with such diverse backgrounds and interests and concerns, and that's exactly what we heard. We've got a few questions coming in from the online world, but we also are going to circulate a microphone. Carol, are you able to do that? You might grab that last microphone and just make sure it's flipped on. If you'd like to ask a question, we'll have a little bit of a Q&A period here before we conclude. Just raise your hand and Carol will come over to you. A question, actually, since I'm the person in control of the microphone, I get to ask my question first, rather than, and there's something that you just said about the way you make your students uncomfortable, and that an important part of growing as a student, that transformational experience that's so central to a Jesuit education, is to become uncomfortable and move through that. Did this document make anybody uncomfortable? Did it have that prophetic voice that would make you uncomfortable? Maybe that's a question for the audience. That's right. So that's what's implied in my question, right? Is that it should have made us uncomfortable. I'm not sure that I felt particularly uncomfortable.
I
Yeah.
didn't feel uncomfortable either. It was just a nice document.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was one of my critiques of it as well, is that I feel like they were trying to sugarcoat the conversation a little bit. And I don't know, I think the wonderful thing about the gospel is that Jesus' words were very provocative, and he challenges us to do things, like you said, that are very uncomfortable. And I didn't really feel that vibe from this document at all. I know, like, especially the beginning parts, it felt very fluffy. And then towards the end, I'm like, yeah, we're finally getting to some concrete stuff. And even then, it didn't feel like it was very, I don't know, hard-hitting, in my
The
opinion.
concrete suggestion was to go to a museum.
Yeah. And I mean, I went to the African American Museum, and I will admit, like, as someone that's learning about a lot of this stuff from Fresh Set of Eyes, it was really hard to look at. But again, I think what Cynthia said is right. Like, not at first, you know, especially if you live in Chicago, like, you have access to that in your own backyard. Like, you have access to history in your own backyard. And so I don't think everybody necessarily would have to travel to go see instances of racism. And then also, even if you can't even afford to make such a trip, I think that's kind of hard. So then it's very easy for you to say, oh, I can't go to DC because I can't afford it, so I can't do this. I think it would have been good to have some, like, even local examples of things to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on that too. I was thinking I was the only one who was gonna be like, yeah, it made me, like, it was cute. It was a nice document. I mean, I liked that Dr. Stewart mentioned Saint Sabina as a radical, like, and Father Flager as a radical disciple. As someone who is inundated in the racial justice sphere, and especially in the Black community, I honestly don't have time for, like, cute documents that kind of speak about, in general, what racism is. The community that I work in and that I live in is in crisis. Like, it's beyond, you know, discussing the nice, you know, like, in theory, what racism looks like. It's playing out every day at 26 and Cal, every day on the west side, where I was gonna send my Canvas team over to the west side on Hoyne Street off of Madison. We were gonna canvas that area. And one of my canvassers lives over there, and he was like, yo, Candice, we can't go over there today because it is wild. Like, it's a lot of, I mean, like, this is happening every day, and it's because of systemic racism and divestment from our community. So I was reading this document. I was like, okay, this is nice. I'm glad the effort was made. But, like, in the city of Chicago, like, we have to be to the point where we're talking about real radical and solutions for, like, now. A suggestion that I would make for someone that wants to, like you said, do something more than go to a museum, come out and canvas a community. I do it every day. That's something that makes you uncomfortable, to knock on someone's door that you don't know. And I'm not gonna lie, as a white person, they're gonna think you're the police. I'm just gonna throw that out there. Like, they're gonna think you're the police. They're not gonna wanna talk to you. For me, they think I'm selling something because there's so many scams going on in low-income Black communities. So to establish that trust, to even get a conversation going, like, that's something that I would encourage anyone to do. And I actually have left pamphlets on all the tables. So, you know, if anybody wants to volunteer and do that, it's very rewarding, and it's really like being in the communities and talking to people. And then just the act of someone going to your door and asking you, like, what keeps you up at night? Like, what are you concerned about in your community, and what can you do about that? So many people don't get asked that question. And I feel like the church can have a role in that as well.
Yeah.
Good. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand. Go right over there. We've got one online after that.
Dr. Stewart is laughing because she's my wife, so she knew I was going to say something.
Congratulations.
So, yes. So I'm Gerald Stewart, but on the 51st anniversary of Dr. King's death at the Lorraine Motel, and we all agree at this point that that document didn't make anyone uncomfortable that you read. Dr. King made folks uncomfortable, obviously. I'm reminded of an event when Harry Belafonte came to St. Sabina and talked about, Dr. King told them how our battle must be won in the courts. So they had to get Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at that time, on board. So they did somewhat similar to a Sankofa. Took Bobby Kennedy down to Alabama, let him literally see kids that weren't eating lunch, and he couldn't fathom, no one's eating lunch, why aren't they eating lunch? Well, they don't have food to eat. And at that point, Dr. King says, now we have won his soul. And in doing so, Bobby Kennedy then backed everything that Dr. King wanted to do. But my question is to the panel, in your opinion, in light of things that is going on with the Catholic Church that we know all about right now, are they able to win the soul and become that prophetic voice that's needed to make folks uncomfortable now, to push the political will to acknowledge racism and be that voice that Dr. King was to Lyndon Johnson at that time and with the Voting Rights Act? Is the Catholic Church, or the church at all, the church at large, able to become that prophetic voice in this day?
I know.
Now you're on the spot.
How do we answer this? I mean, I guess for me, I would say that's where I think it comes back to history. And I think when you're like, okay, so we look at this from a spiritual standpoint. When we struggle with sin, the only way that we can really deal with that sin is acknowledging that it's there and taking the steps to change that. And I think that's where the church as a whole has failed, is we have a hard time, or we're sometimes unwilling to even admit that we're part of the problem. And I know from my own context, a lot of the time when these topics are kind of starting to rise to the surface, there's this global thing of like, oh, we can't get political. And the reality is everything we do is political, even us being in school and, you know, going to a job and, you know, getting up in the ladder and trying to, everything is political. And so I think sometimes in being afraid of really addressing the issue, we find ways to, like, I guess, undermine what we could be doing and avoiding it. And so until we're really willing to do that, I think that's where we're not going to really be able to build the trust that we need. Because I think it's one thing if you admit that you're wrong and you make those steps to change that, but if you're continuously being like, no, I didn't do anything, or I haven't had a part, I think it really hurts our credibility as a church when we're trying to say that we want to, you know, help other people and serve them and be inclusive and whatever you want to add to the mix, and we're not really, you know, matching that in action. And I think that's something that is highlighted in scripture all the time, like our words need to match our action, because that's what people are going to see. They're going to see that action.
The thing that comes to mind is especially the current generation, there are some within the generation that see the church as being hypocritical. And for that, a lot of them say, I don't want to go to church. And they see themselves as Christian or spiritual, but they see that the church is hypocritical. And I think that that's something that the church widely, no matter what the denomination is, needs to really take a look at that. And I think that's one thing that needs to take place. One of the things that we're starting to see with the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and all of that, we're starting back these movements. And I think similar to what Father Flager's been doing is you have to put feet to the ground. And it's what Father Flager used to say, that you come to church on Sunday, and and it's kind of like the football team, right? So this is the huddle. So on Sundays, this is the huddle. This is where you get your instructions. This is where you get what you need. But then Monday through Friday, you're going out to play the game. So what are you going to do with the tools that you've learned on Sunday in order to play that out Monday through Saturday? And I think that's some things that's missing, that there needs to be more feet on the ground. Actually, churches that are going out and actually going to other communities and, like I stated earlier, hearing, the voices of the others, those who are disenfranchised, and being able to see what is it that we can do as a church in order to help you. And for them to be able to, if you go on the south side of Chicago, there's probably 3 churches on every block. And one of the disconnects is those churches don't talk to each other. And there's like, this is my church, that's your church, that's his church. But there's no, let's come together, and how can we help? People come together for a photo op, they come together for the videos, but then what are you doing after all of that is over with? We have kids dying every day. And we're at the point, and I'm saying we because I can put myself within that, where it's desensitized. And it's like, okay, you see the news, that's just another kid that got killed. That's another innocent person. But what's the action that we could do? What's policies that needs to be that going to Springfield and being able to do that as an action? How can you connect with organizations that are, doing policy changes and working with your aldermen and working with, the various elected officials in order for a change to happen? So we can continue to, talk about it, but what's the action? And I think, I think that this next generation that is coming up, they're seeing that nobody else is stepping up, and we're going to step up and we're going to do something about it. And it's not the role of the ones who have been doing all of this for all of these years, but I think it's their role to be there to support them and to not go in and take over, but allow them to do the things that they're doing, but support them in some kind of way. So that's the way that I would answer that question.
There was an online question, I might interject here really quick. It was actually a comment and a question that popped up, Nephtalie, when you were speaking, and the phrase came out, we all have blind spots. There was this idea that there are things that we're not seeing, and we won't see them, to follow the metaphor, until you turn and look. Just when you're driving, if you don't turn and look, you have no idea what's actually there.
Yeah.
You have this blind spot in your ability to relate to other people. Everybody does. But then there's a question. If we all have blind spots, who really is this letter for? Who are the people that need to draw on the title, Open Wide Our Hearts? Who are the people that need to open their hearts? Is it good enough to say everyone who has a blind spot? I'm going to say that it's the white folks in the room. That's what I'm hearing. It's almost like a document written by white folks for white folks. We need to open our hearts to you all. But aren't you already in the church? Here you are. I don't know. I was a little confused by that, and I think this is reflected in some ways by the question. Go ahead, Kandice. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. I would agree with that a little bit. When I first read the document, I was like, yeah, skim it. I had to make myself really take my time to read it, because I was like, African-American experience, like, we know these things. But I think that it's for everyone. I think we all have blind spots. Something that I didn't mention while I was doing my remarks is, even in the quest for Black liberation, as Black folks, we have to acknowledge the privilege that we have when it comes to other communities as well. So some of the work that I'm starting to do with my organization is building unification with Latinx communities, because there's injustices that we're turning blind eyes to at the same times where we're experiencing injustice. So I think the letter in that sense can really be for everyone, because even as a minority or underprivileged, community, there's levels of privilege within everything: gender, sexual orientation. I mean, there's economic ability, so I think the letter can speak to all of us in that sense.
Yeah, I definitely would agree, and that's where I would say too, that's why I mentioned like understanding the cost of bringing stuff up, because I think it's one thing to know the information, but then it's another thing to like take the step to actually talk to your family members or your parish or your whatever community you're a part of. And I think that extra step is a lot of times where we miss the opportunity to really cause effective change. And I know even from my own experiences, I'll have friends that, they themselves may not consider themselves racist or may not hold many racist thoughts or opinions, whatever. But then on the other hand, they'll have people within their own sphere, whether, especially if it's like family, that are saying things, and they're not always willing to, hey, like, Uncle Bob, maybe you shouldn't say this, and this is why. And so I think when you're silent in that way as well, you're also not helping the conversation happen. And then, yes, I completely agree about, even as women of color here, we have our own privilege, but I think it also helps when we're not the only ones having this conversation, or we're not the only ones saying something. Because I know for me, I'm willing to have these conversations, but I'm also always thankful when I have allies that are not Black that are willing to be like, hey, this is a conversation that I need to have, and they're willing to step in it with me. And it doesn't have to feel like this daunting task that only I have to carry. So yeah, I would say that, yes, it's helpful for, I guess, non-Black people, but also for, but all of us are included as well in that.
You had a question?
You're preaching to the choir here, There's nobody here who does not agree with you. So when you're talking about canvassing, shouldn't the canvas be where, with the privileged white folks like us? And I thought it was very naive for you to say you've never met a pure racist. I'm from Batavia. Come to my house. It's such a hard thing. On one hand, you want to change the community you're in, but on the other hand, you want to change the community that has the power, and that is the white folk. That is the ones that are electing our president. That is the one that are recreating the racism that keeps going. And what a I don't even think this is a question, it's just a comment. It's a hard road. I don't know that there's any way, but what you're doing is just digging little trenches and, building ant hills on top of ant hills until you have a mountain. But it's not just the Black people who need to be canvassed, it's the white folk.
And I'll respond to that, and I can see where you're saying, I'm from Mobile, Alabama, so I've met racists. I was just saying, I don't think that's like, the letter kind of spoke to racism in a broad stroke. I was like, I don't think I see that every day of like a purely racist person. I think a lot of people fall within spectrums of that. But I understand what you're saying. I guess I meant it in the sense of like, I focus my work in working with Black communities, because we have to, my work is around building power within our own communities, because we don't need anyone to liberate us. We have to liberate ourselves. So that's why I just spoke to that canvas, because, I think, I agree with you. I think those folks, the Trump voters, like I said, I'm from Alabama, the majority of people that live in our 30,000 people came to a rally in my hometown. I happened to be home for Donald Trump, and I was like, what is this? It's crazy. But I'm going to agree with Nephtalie, because the power of me saying it is, they're going to say, okay, well, you're a Black woman, and of course you feel like that. I would, pass that back over to you, like canvass your own community, like she said, talk to your own families. I know there's things that I talk to my family about, even though we're Black folks. Like I said, we have our prejudice as well, and I say, Grandmama, like, I know you grew up in the 40s, but we can't think like that anymore, you know? We have to have those comments, and they think I'm radical and say, no, you went up to the north and got all that radical stuff in your head, you know? I mean, it is what it is, but I think what she said is about talking with our own communities. So in that sense, I think that's a great idea. I love canvases wherever they are, and like teaching people how to have those conversations. So that's something we can talk about, like how to start a canvas within your own community to have these discussions, because it's more powerful when it comes from your neighbor or from someone that you kind of have that trust with.
Mhm.
Oh, just honestly, just you can start by doing it yourself. You can just go door to door, depending on what your no, like I know I've worked for political campaigns, and we literally put a little, like I have a little document that says how to start your own canvas. If you say, for instance, wanted to talk to folks about like the ICE detention center that they're proposing to build in Dwight, Illinois, that people don't know about, that's really scary that there's funding going towards those things that are being built right outside of Chicago. Like, you know, you could come up with a little script, you could go by yourself or get a friend or two or a family member and just literally go knock on your neighbor's door and say, hey, do you have, you know, a minute to, well, don't ever ask them if you have a minute, because they're never gonna have a minute. So just, you know, say, hey, like, you know, I wanted to let you know, do you know about this happening? And you can just ask something simple as, how does that feel? Like, do you agree with that? Like, does that not scare you that that's happening in your community? And it's just that kind of conversation. You can invite people over your home. I mean, it's really, it doesn't have to be through an organization. A lot of these organizations are started by just people starting to have conversations within their friend groups and families, and then it becomes something.
And I think we don't give the church enough power to do things. Because I know as a social worker, if somebody's like, oh, there's homeless population, who can you recommend for me to, what organization can I send them to? I'm like, we're a church. Like, if you look at every pew, I'm sure you'll find like a doctor, a lawyer, everything from any type of, you know, job or environment, you'll find it in our pews. So I think, you know, we kind of outsource a lot more than we need to. And I mean, if we look in Acts, like they did not do that. It's not like Paul was like, let's call an organization, and like they did the work. And I think that's something that we kind of have to get back to, of doing the work. And I think it is nice that the fact that we are privileged enough to have some organizations out there, but I'm kind of at a place where we're like, we don't need any more organizations. We just need to, you know, be the hands and feet like we're called to do, and actually do the work, and stop depending on other people to do that for us, especially if we're, you know, able to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. One of the things, and I'm sorry if I'm continuing to talk about St. Sabina, but one of the things that we did was to find out those within the church who had specific, you know, whatever the job they had or specific experiences, and actually using them, and we put together like a resource book, so that you could use the resources within the church. So if you need a doctor, or if you need someone who has experience with construction, if you need experience with someone who have XYZ, it's within the church, as she stated. And I think a lot of times that is like missing. And that goes back to what I was talking about, you know, the asset-based community development, is finding out what are the assets. All of us have gifts and resources that could be, you know, shared with so many other individuals. And if you could find what is that asset within, you know, each person, and then be able to, you know, use that as a catalyst and, you know, empowering them. That's one of the things that I think is missing sometimes in communities, is empowering individuals. There's a lot of hopelessness within communities because they don't feel power. They don't feel as if that they have a right. Within a lot of the African American communities, the average youth is probably not going to go 5 blocks more within where they live. I remembered when I interviewed a couple of the youth that was in the Cabrini Green area, And, I mean, right here at the Magnificent Mile, 8 blocks from where Cabrini Green is at Wells Street, 8 blocks from there to Michigan Avenue. And majority of those youth that I talked to said, I've never, ever been on Michigan Avenue. Why? Because, one, I don't feel comfortable. 2, what am I, like, I don't feel as if I fit in if I was to go, in that particular area. So it's about, making that space, like I talked about earlier, where it's empowerment. How can you empower individuals to know? One of the things that I would say privileged me was the priests at my parish. The way that, I had a loving family, and, they exposed me to a lot of things. But one of the things, he took me out of my neighborhood and took us to various places throughout the city. We would come down here to Shed Aquarium and with the fireworks, and he would just put us in a van and say, let's go down and we're going to watch the fireworks, or take me to another suburb that I've never, ever been to before. And that's one of the things that I've always said is exposure. When you expose someone to something that they've never, ever experienced before, it's eye-opening. So when you take a kid from a disenfranchised community and bring them downtown or take them somewhere else, it opens their eyes to, oh, wow, I didn't know that there was this other part of the city. I've heard about it, but I didn't know anything about it. So I would just add that.
So I was really struck, what you said, Cynthia, I think I've heard echoed a lot in other conversations with Timon and other people, that somehow the Black Catholic experience is like exceptional or extra or something, that it's not, it's atypical. And it sort of made me think also about like what we were talking about, the neighborhoods here, like if you, there's wider ramifications or resonances with that. So the idea that like, most people on the Gold Coast here have been in this country for 2 or 3 generations probably. A lot of, immigrants, sons of Irish immigrants or Jewish or something. The people on the South Side have been here for 10 or 12 generations, right? So whose America is it? Whose church is it? Whose Chicago is it? And so like I sort of, recognizing explicitly 2 things. One, first, the sort of privilege of male, celibate, educational, all of that. And then secondly, that this is somehow not a cure-all or a tokenism thing. I do think it's worth sort of noting publicly today that Pope Francis has now named what will undoubtedly be his most important nomination in the Catholic Church to be a Black man, an African-American man. Wilton Gregory will be the new Archbishop and very likely Cardinal of Chicago. And so that will be the most lasting stamp that Pope Francis has put on the, of Washington. I'm sorry, yeah, of Washington. He's from Chicago, though, actually. Right. But the most lasting stamp that he will have put on the American church. And again, it's not a cure-all to say, one person in power. But I do think that it's worth noting that Black leadership in the church is sorely needed. And so it's one small step, perhaps. I don't know if there's any comments.
I think there was one other question back there, Josh, by the table.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments, everyone. And I agree with what Neff was saying. I was actually just in a conversation with the church recently about this and about how the members love to give just a little bit of money to do the work, but will we actually commit to showing up too, and the challenges with showing up? And so I think across the board, that's key. And then also, thank you for your comments on Haiti. I run a social enterprise in Haiti and kind of see that all the time and see, especially with dealing with those cross-cultural challenges, it's why the social enterprise is 100% run by Haitians in Haiti. We just serve in an advisory capacity and supporting getting them resources stateside. So thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you for the comments. I really found them extremely informative, especially like the what you were saying about power, and then the notion about Wilton Gregory made me think that he just said today when he was in Washington, D.C., he said, "I'm in a city of the poor and the powerful, and neither knows that they are both." And I thought that was, what a startling way to begin his Episcopal ministry in Washington, D.C. But thank you again for what you offered us tonight.
Well, I think we'll cut the questions off there. I really appreciate the conversation and the kinds of questions. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a hand that just popped up at the last minute. Go ahead. Right. Yeah, thank you. And to add to that, the point that we can leave here discouraged or encouraged, and a way to leave encouraged is to understand the role that each of us can play in moving this forward. And I think I really appreciate in that vein the comments about empowerment that Cynthia was making here just a moment ago. How hard is it really? Like Josh was just saying, we can get people to write a check, but getting them to show up and walk the walk Monday through Saturday is a whole different set of problems. But something as simple and innovative as a resource list. Provide people with opportunities to put their gifts forward, have someone that coordinates those, and then as need emerges and as need is brought to the community has a list of people to call who are already involved in the community who can help in one small way. And when you empower people like that, I think that becomes encouraging. You become more hopeful in the way that you're able to contribute. And that can only lead to more contributions because you'll experience how fulfilling it is to be a part of this network and this work. In any case, thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us online. Of course, we're going to hang out. There's a little bit of food over there. So there's some drink back over here in this corner. So I encourage everybody to hang out and continue the conversation in whatever way you'd like. But let's give one more last round of applause to the folks who showed up for us. Thank you. We appreciate you all. Thank you, everybody.